And let's present again. So what are some of the challenges of qualitative data analysis, especially with larger projects, but even with smaller ones, there's a lot of data. Some of you might have run into this. This is especially true if you transcribe your interviews. If you do a 1-hour interview, it probably takes, depending on how fast you can type, it probably takes 2 or 3 hours to transcribe that 1-hour interview. So, and you get pages and pages and pages just from one interview. So there's a lot of data. And many times the data is very detailed. People are talking in detail about their experiences. And not all of those details are important, but you can't just you can't cut out those things without having a reason to do it. So all of this data, oops, I'm gonna go back here and change it to my pen. All of this data needs to be transformed into something that's useful and readable. If I just give you a 20-page interview transcript and say, here, these are the results, that's not very helpful for you. So the challenge of qualitative research is to take all of that raw data and make it into something that the reader can really lay hold of. But at the same time, when you transform it into something useful, it has to be faithful to the data. So you can't invent something new. It has to be arising out of, or we might say grounded in, the data. So there's this tension between usability and faithfulness. So copying and pasting the transcript into the results section and saying those are the results, that's not helpful. But then if we interpret that interview in a misguided way, then we're not being faithful to the data. Like we discussed already, especially for when you're going to submit this to someone else or as a part of a team, the process needs to be transparent. How you come to your conclusions needs to be transparent. One reason is so that other people can evaluate it, so that people can follow in your steps and decide for themselves if your conclusions are accurate. Another reason is that so that they can repeat it, because if you have teammates that are also doing the same process, it needs to be repeatable. It can't be it can't be some kind of hidden gift that nobody else can do if you're going to work in a team. Like if you're Pablo Picasso and you work in a team of people, all of you trying to create artwork like Pablo Picasso, well, there's only one Pablo Picasso, and everybody else will probably not be able to repeat it, right? Because it's something that's kind of like a gift that's, a talent that's beyond what most normal artists have. But for qualitative data analysis in teams, there needs to be an explicit methodology so others can repeat it and modify it if they need to. So this is kind of the stereotypical or way that qualitative research analysis happens. You have raw data, and then through some kind of mysterious process that nobody can quite explain, you get results. And I'm kind of being a little bit silly here. And everybody likes reading the results. It's interesting, it's kind of fun, but we might not really be sure how these results relate back to the raw data, okay? So there is a better way, hopefully, and that better way would be using a more explicit methodology. And in this particular chapter that we just read, they have these different means, but you can make your methodology more explicit. and really connecting the results clearly to the data. That way the reader can both take action, but they can also move backwards if they want. They can say, oh, where did this conclusion come from? It's linked back to the data in a certain way. So it's really forging stronger links between your data collection and then your data analysis and interpretation. And as always, interrupt me if you have any questions or things like that. They talked about some data analysis goals. I don't know if I'm going to go through these as much. I will say typologies are interesting. Categorizing things in different ways. So for data analysis, you're looking for relationships and patterns. What is the underlying structure in this case? Or what is the nature of this phenomenon? What are the associations between different parts? So associations, we can't really say causation because this is not quantitative, but you can certainly look for associations. What are some explanations? What are some new ideas, theories, or strategies? So data analysis, the goal is something coherent and a pattern to a method and a pattern to the madness, not the madness. What is the pattern within the mess of the data? This is the features of their particular framework. I think most of it is pretty clear. One thing that they're really worried about and concerned about is retrieval. So they want you to be able to go back to the original data if you need to, so that everything that they have said in their conclusion is proved and you can trace it back to the original. So they're very careful about tying that all together. And they're also concerned about accessibility because they have an audience. They have people that hire them to do research, and then so they need to be able to be open to judgment, open to evaluation. It's not like you can just say, well, this is the conclusion because this is what I figured out and I can't explain more than that. They have to be able to go into detail about how they reach those conclusions so that others can weigh in on it. We'll look quickly at the stages that they go through for qualitative data analysis. It's similar to what we talked about earlier in the semester. I think that they're just, they're focused more on larger teams. So this framework works better for larger quantities of data. It could work also for an individual project, but it probably doesn't need to be done quite as thoroughly. I'll explain that. But so these are their steps: familiarization, identifying a thematic framework, indexing, charting, and mapping and interpretation. This is another way of depicting it. I separated these two in their description. These were all one. It was creating a thematic framework, but really it's, in my mind, two steps. So it depends on how you see it. The first step would be creating an initial thematic framework, and the second step is revising it. They put that all as one step. It's really whichever way you want to think about it. So familiarization, some people call this immersing yourself in the data. An easy way to do it, if you're doing interviews, is simply by transcribing the interview. I mean, like I said, a 1-hour interview, it'll take you 2 hours, 3 hours, maybe longer if you don't type fast to transcribe it. So that means you're spending a lot of time listening to that interview, thinking about it as you transcribe it. That's a simple way to immerse yourself. Of course, if you're not going to transcribe it yourself, then you need to reread some of the data. Now, you might not be able to read everything if there's a lot of data. It just depends on how much there is. They said that if there's too much, then you need to purposefully select some of it, because you really want to get a sense for this data. And they didn't emphasize this, but I would emphasize it because it becomes important in the next step. Take notes on the recurrent themes and issues. So we talked about first cycle coding. This is more or less what they are talking about. It's not quite as detailed though, because they're talking about larger quantities of data. But it's what are the recurrent themes and issues, taking notes on that, kind of getting a sense for some of the initial patterns that you might see. Familiarization is getting to know your data, so to speak. Here's a nice quote: gaining an overview of the richness, depth, and diversity of the data. That's an interesting way of putting it. So after you're familiar with your data, you want to identify a thematic framework. And this is, how would you do that? Well, you have to think about your research purpose. You always want to think about, what are the research questions? What's the goal? What were the interview questions? And then, because qualitative data is emergent, what are the unexpected issues that came up? So what did people talk about that you didn't expect? Because that's important too. It's not just what you're focused on, but what is really out there. And then, what themes do we notice? This is, of course, you always look for that. So I would say this is similar to what we might call second cycle coding. What's the bigger picture? What are the major themes? And so you're building, so you look through your data, or at least some of it, you build kind of an initial sense or a framework, and then you have to check it to see if it kind of matches, because the initial thematic framework is probably just based on some of the data, not all of it, because if you have hundreds and hundreds of pages, it's not possible to read it all before developing a framework. So then they want you to apply this thematic framework to all the data. And this is where you really get into the detailed part of it, where you take that initial framework and you create what they call an index, which is, if you look here, they have kind of the major themes, like patterns of expenditure, patterns of management, and then they have sub themes here, la, 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 la. So for your guys' individual projects, most of you will just have major themes and not sub themes, but that's because you've interviewed maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 people. But imagine that there's 100 people that you've talked to. Well, then you can get into much more detail with your themes. And so this indexing is creating kind of a framework, and then you lay that on top of your data. It requires a measure of judgment and intuition, so it's not all, just kind of plug and play. The most important, maybe not the most important thing, but an important thing, excuse me, is that when you label your data with these numbers and with these labels, it connects the data to your framework, and then other people can check it. I'll show you an example here. So here's an interview transcript, and you see that they have overlaid their framework on it. So they have the number, and then they have the kind of the code that goes with it. And so this section of text right here is now linked to this code. The advantage of that is, let's say you're using some kind of an electronic database and you type in code 3.7, then boom, all of that text connected to code 3.7 is listed there for you. And then let's say that you look in the conclusion section and you read about loans, debts, and arrears, and you think, I don't know, like, what is the actual data that supports that? Well, all you have to do is, probably with a computer database, but you could do it another way, is you need to look back to this text that is linked to that and see if you can make the same conclusion or not. So this is, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question, because in my research project, I collected most of my data from like the forums and other articles, and I only have like one interview. So when I index, should I put what I transcribe onto the article also, or how do I do that?
So this is more for, so when you actually write it up, you're not going to include the whole article, the whole interview, right? But let's say that I, as your advisor, or let's say that someone is on your research team, and they look at your analysis and they say, hey, I'm not really sure if this code is the best code for this situation. Can I look at the data that it's based on? So that's when you need to be able to show me your transcript and that section of text that supports your conclusion. So it's carefully labeling. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. So do the groundwork just in case. Okay, I got it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm probably not going to go back and double check it, but imagine that I'm a politician or something, or that's going to have to make a decision based on what you've recommended. Well, I need to, probably a politician wouldn't do it, but probably somebody in their office would, hopefully double check to make sure that it's all on the up and up. And someone on your team also, they might come to slightly different understandings. And so it's helpful to have your conclusions, like there's a breadcrumb trail back to the data.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully when you include quotes and paraphrases in your write-up, that is really your support. And that's what I'm looking for. I mean, this is an undergraduate class, so you guys are not professional researchers doing public policy research. I don't expect what they're talking about, but I do expect that your quotes and paraphrases clearly support your conclusions. I mean, because I can read those quotes and I can think, well, that doesn't really say what you're saying it says, So that's what I'll be looking for. All right, and then they use charting, which is not something that we are going to need to do, but this is more for bigger projects, and it's for public policy and probably for other things too. And basically it's taking those little chunks of data from the transcripts, and let's say everything that's related to, let's say, expenditure management, everything that's related to that, it's like cutting it out of the transcript and piling it all in one list or one bucket or one category. And so going back to, let's say that I want to search your data for everything related to expenditure management. Well, I type that in and then boom, it just lists all of those quotations. So it's really taking it out of its original context and then lumping it all together. And it's helpful because I didn't call it charting, but when I used a software program for my own personal dissertation research, it was helpful to be able to type in a code word, and then the computer program would take all of those pieces of data and extract them from the interviews and list them all for me. So I didn't have to go search through piles and piles of information to find those quotes and find that data. It was all in a chart, you might say, or in a category for me. That's the value of it. They have an example in the chapter, if it's helpful for you. It's decontextualizing and recontextualizing it, you might say. The last part is the interpretation part. They call it mapping and interpretation. And this is where you're really coming to the point where what is the structure, what is the pattern, what are the connections, what are the relationships. And many times in qualitative research, part of it will be like a diagram or a chart, some kind of a visual that shows you the relationships. They have some examples from their text. You might want to just go back and look at them. This is one of them here. They've got a continuum. They've got different stages, labeling. So trying to show in a chart or a visual kind of form the relationships between these different themes. So, you've got all of these were probably themes. All of these words were probably themes within the data, but then you can just lump all those themes together, but then how do those themes relate to one another, So they have a nice chart here. Here's another one here. They have, they've got, I think these are the major themes here: practical incentives, changing perceptions, higher profile modes of recruitment, and then they've got different sub-themes under that. This is a simpler form, and it's not like you have to think, oh, I've got to have a fancy chart like this. Like, your chart has to be based on the data. You can't say, oh, my goal is to have a cool chart. So whatever the data actually gives you, then you have to describe it as best you can that way. And of course, this is all surrounded by text, by your own description. It's not like you just put a chart in your conclusion and that's the end. The chart is really to illustrate your own writing and conclusions. All right, so just to recap, we've gone through all of this. Like I said, this part is, they call it one step, creating a thematic framework. I think it's 2 steps, because you create a framework and then you check the framework to make sure that it fits. Because this first step is really just based on your initial impressions. And you don't want to just run with your impressions. You need to check it and make sure it actually fits the data. And then they want you to go and apply it to the entire corpus of data. And this, once again, this is for large amounts of data, but the same process can basically be followed for any size project. Some of these stages will probably be condensed or collapsed, but it's the same idea. All right. Questions about what we have done so far today? I should look in the chat too. All right, here's what we're going to do. Let's see, it's 11:38. So I want us to practice qualitative data analysis again. Of course, we're not going to analyze hundreds of pages. I'm going to send you out a Google form, and I'm going to give you 20 minutes, I think. Yeah, I'll just give you until 12 o'clock. 20 minutes, so you can take a break and also answer the questions on the Google form. And then we're all going to look at this data together. So, and analyze it together and look for themes. So keep in mind that, I won't include your name with it, but we're all going to look at your answers. So it's not going to be like kind of a private data between me and you. It'll be for our class to practice on. So just keep that in mind as you answer. I don't think there's anything too personal with the questions that you're going to answer. It's just about online learning. So I'm not asking very personal questions. All right, so I'm going to send out the form to all of you now by email. Here, what I can do is I'll just put it in the chat also. That's what I'll do. And just answer as much as you can. If you don't finish the form by 12 o'clock, no big deal. But I think it's only 3 questions anyway. Oops, that's not the form because I clicked on the wrong one. There it is. Yeah, so if you don't finish it, just send what you can by 12 o'clock. All right, let's see here. I'm going to do this. All right, so I'm going to put the link in the chat, and then I will also send it to you by email. And I will see you guys in 20 minutes at 12 o'clock.